My name is Elizabeth Bice. I am the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a steering committee member of the NDP Socialist Caucus, and past Secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council. We acknowledge that this gathering takes place on the Indigenous lands, including the unceded territories of the Mississaugas, of the New Credit, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's webcast is titled, Is There a Magic Money Tree? Really, is there a magic money tree? With Radhika Desai, Professor, Department of Political Studies, University of Manitoba, and discussants Yasin in Toronto, and Gary Porter on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. And I will be hosting the show. Radhika will give a talk for about 25 minutes, followed by Yasin, who will speak for about 5 minutes, and then Gary, who also will speak for 5 minutes. Then we'll take a few minutes from a few questions from the online audience. Audience people can submit a question by accessing the webcast directly from YouTube and by typing the questions directly into the chat column. Please direct your questions to a specific person if you want, or just put it out there in general. And all three can answer, or just one or two. It's up to our panelists. So, also, if you like this webcast, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree with what you hear during this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up on our website, www.socialistaction.ca, and by calling us 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. So, folks, let's begin. Radhika is a professor of the Department, as I said, of Political Studies and director. She's also of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group and at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. She is also the author of Geopolitical Economy, After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization and Empire, 2013, and other books as well. She is a member of the Venezuela Peace Committee in Winnipeg. So please welcome Radhika.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and thank you to Socialist Action and Barry and I think Rosemary, who had a part to play in inviting me. I'm very pleased to be here. The idea of this, my thinking on this and the idea of this presentation really emerges from the context of the present pandemic. And let me just set out that present pandemic context a little bit. In the middle of March, just when various parts of the country began to lock down, I published a short piece in Canadian Dimension, which I entitled The Unexpected Reckoning, Coronavirus and Capitalism. And in it, I made certain arguments which form the necessary background to what we are going to talk about today. So I pointed out, of course, that the pandemic emerges from the environmental contradictions of neoliberal capitalism, the constant cheapening of inputs such as labor and land and natural resources, which leads to the ever more extensive exploitation, has actually led to habitat loss for many animals, and it has made zoonotic viruses more and more common. So we, of course, have in the context of the pandemic a public health crisis, but the public health crisis has necessitated an economic crisis, because essentially the neoliberal policies that we had followed for the last 40 years had weakened our public health systems. They had weakened our economic and productive capacity, particularly in the most neoliberal countries such as the United Kingdom, the United States, and to a great extent Canada as well. They have, of course, increased financial burdens on precisely the most productive elements of society, whether they are small businesses or workers or what have you. And in addition, thanks to neoliberal hollowing out, they hollowed out, they weakened the ability of states and the state capacity and the political capacity to compensate for these problems. So you put all those things together, And what should have been a small public health crisis, of course, an emergency, it's a very serious crisis, a very serious virus, but it would not have required such severe and long lockdowns as we've seen. And that's partly why we have seen these kind of lockdowns in the most neoliberal countries, whereas countries such as China have been able to respond better and actually come out and back to some kind of normality much quicker than us. So the less neoliberal a country is, the better it has fared. So among the capitalist economies, for example, Germany, which is considerably less neoliberal, has preserved more of its state capacity, its public health capacity, and its productive capacity has come out much better. And socialist ones, of course, have done much better. Now, of course, we are very aware that amid the deepening crisis of capitalism, and remember, the other argument that I made in this article is I said that the economic crisis is not just due to the pandemic. It is actually the acceleration of crisis tendencies that had been gathering for a long time in this in neoliberal society. So it's the crisis of neoliberal capitalist societies that we are witnessing. All the ills of neoliberal capitalism have been laid bare. Um, the environment, to some extent, got a bit of a respite, and people began to think about how to build better out of the crisis. And so the whole series of ideas began to be floated in terms of how to tackle homelessness and poverty, rewild nature, move away from fossil fuels. You know, there was been this oversupply of oil, and people are talking about peak oil and the passing of the age of oil, degrowth, transforming our cities, digitizing. The list is exceedingly long and diverse. However, in this context, two ideas have really floated to the top. One is modern monetary theory, and the second is universal basic income. Um, I want to note to begin with that, interestingly, both involve money. Um, I'm not actually going to talk directly about UBI, although we can talk about it. I'm going to focus on modern monetary theory. And the idea of modern monetary theory is precisely expressed in this title that I have given, where people talk about the fact that, or people talk about the assertion that there is a magic money tree, that we don't have to worry about, how money for social programs, etc., are going to come from, or money for universal basic income is going to come from. So both of these involve money in a very critical way. Both ideas have their rational kernels. I'm not saying they are all wrong, but I'm going to say something much more critical than perhaps many imagine. However, so my main point, however, about both of them is that neither can work without bringing about the democratically planned organization of production of a wide range of necessities. That is to say, no planning, presumably democratic planning, but no planning, we cannot solve any problems. So that gives you an idea of where I'm going. So, what about this magic money tree? What is modern monetary theory? Modern monetary theory is a theory stating that a country with monetary sovereignty, so any country that has monetary sovereignty faces no budget constraint, cannot run out of money, can meet all its obligations with the money it creates itself, and it can set the interest rate it has to pay on the obligations that it issues. So these are the four things that a country can do when it has monetary sovereignty. And the advocates of MMT define monetary sovereignty as the attribute of a country whose national government chooses the money of account, that is, chooses what is the money that is going to circulate in the currency and that everybody is going to use, imposes taxes denominated in that money or currency, issues that currency, accepts it as payment for taxes, and issues all debt in that currency only. That is to say that, and this last point is very important, any country that issues debt in a foreign currency is not monetarily sovereign. Okay, so with those things in mind, let's proceed. First of all, I want to concede that MMT has a rational kernel. There's a reason why it has become so popular, and that reason is entirely understandable. The key reason is that it refutes the notion introduced by Margaret Thatcher that there is no alternative to neoliberalism. There is no alternative to deregulation, privatization, cutting wages of workers, attacking unions, private, yeah, all the things that I mentioned. So, and if we can break down this, and of course, refuting Tina has been the crying need of our time. For 40 years, we have heard the same message, and people are fed up. So when somebody comes along and says, you know what, it's not true, everybody is bound to listen, and as they should. Okay. I'll break this down into two parts. So as I say, it refutes Tina. The first part is that the idea that there is no money for important social programs, for public investment, etc. It does a second thing, which is equally important, and it is very much part of the times in which we live. You think about the before there was any serious public health response to the pandemic, the United States public authorities, particularly the Federal Reserve, essentially was already responding to the crisis it saw coming. How did it respond to the crisis? It issued liquidity like there was no tomorrow, like they essentially opened all the dams and money simply flowed out of the Federal Reserve into the banking system. And they lowered interest rates, they filled the banking system with liquidity. And of course, the result of that action has been that all those historic declines in asset markets, stock markets, bond markets, you name it, all these markets that declined, in March, they are all back to where they were, thanks to the Federal Reserve's issuance of liquidity and so on. Okay, so people who are MMT advocates have pointed out, look, money printing is already happening. Governments and central banks in financialized neoliberal economies are printing money to shore up delinquent financial sectors that cause financial crises. So if we can bail those people out, why can't we print money to spend on more radical purposes, such as a Green New Deal or a universal jobs guarantee? These are the two favorite proposals of the people who advocate MMT. So people have been thirsting for alternatives, and they see money printing is already happening. So what's the magic here? Now, this is the key to understanding why it has become so influential, and even important political leaders like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are actually saying, I'm a believer in MMT, I'm going to, implement MMT, etc. Few economic doctrines have become so influential, certainly not progressive ones coming from the left. Now, okay, so I've laid out all this for you. Now I want to go into the criticisms. So the criticisms would be, so first I want to deal with the prevailing criticisms, the criticisms that have already been made by other people, economists, etc. And then I want to talk about some further criticisms that I would like to propose. So let's go through the prevailing criticisms first. Some economists consider modern monetary theory to be only the latest incarnation of a long history of monetary quackery. Monetary quackery that is designed to show that the ills of the human race are all due to monetary mismanagement, and they can all be cured by a little bit of monetary tinkering. Typically, these sorts of solutions emerge from practical men. I mean, you can think of, for example, labor chits or giving money dates. You have to spend them by a certain date and everything would be fine, and so on. These usually emerge from people who consider themselves practical men, not from economists or scholars. Now, in the case of MMT, it's a little bit different. There are a number of academic economists who are like Randall Wray and so on, who have been, Stephanie Kelton, of course, who have been advocating modern monetary theory. But interestingly, if you look at the history of MMT, the origins of MMT are usually dated sometime in the mid-1990s, what we see is a hedge fund manager called Warren Mosler coming up with some of the basic ideas in 1995 and giving money to the University of Missouri, Kansas City, to essentially propagate these ideas. So in a certain sense, this practical man is certainly the origin of modern monetary theory. So obviously, so some economists call it quack. Other economists are doing something else. What they say is they take what I call a new and true attitude to it. Let me explain that. Ages ago, George Bernard Shaw was pestered by a friend of his, not a very close friend, but nevertheless, let's say an acquaintance of his, to review a book that acquaintance had written. And Bernard Shaw tried to put him off, but eventually the guy was too persistent, so Shaw relented. He wrote a review. In this review, Bernard Shaw basically said the following. In this book, there is much that is true and much that is new. However, what is new is not true, and what is true is not new. Now, if you read many of the criticisms of MMT that have been made by lots of economists, this is what they are saying, is that insofar as there is anything true in MMT, we've known it for yonks. Okay, and what they are saying that's new is actually not true. So among the untrue things that they point out, and by the way, let me also say that what they mean when they say that it's not new is they point out that thinkers like John Maynard Keynes, for example, had Hyman Minsky, many others had already pointed out many of the things that modern monetary theory claims to have discovered, but these are not new discoveries. They've been around for years. Okay, what is it that is new that is actually not true? So people point out that, first of all, MMT sticks to a very chartalist conception of money. That is to say, the chartalism is the name given to the theories that say that all money is issued by the state. And the unfortunate thing about this is that while states do continue to issue money in our time, the more important and the larger amount of money issuance actually happens in banks. And MMT tends to fudge the issue of banks and states. So essentially people say, well, is this modern monetary theory or is it medieval monetary theory? So that's the first kind of criticism of those who say that what's new in MMT is not true. Secondly, they point out that this therefore misunderstands how money really functions in a capitalist economy, because in a capitalist economy, it has to have a function which is to provide liquidity. And therefore, in order to provide liquidity, that is to say, in order for money to be there when important actors need it, whether you are a producer, a consumer, whatever, money needs to retain its value. And MMT seems to think that money just has a value and never loses it, which is, we know it is not true. Money can lose its value. There can be inflation. There can be hyperinflation. There can be all of these things. So it is simply, they seem not to understand how a capitalist economy actually functions. Thirdly, the people point out that it also misunderstands thirdly, there is a criticism of the idea of monetary sovereignty. MMT basically assumes that the idea of monetary sovereignty applies to nearly all economies, but that is in fact not the case. In reality, actually, let me rephrase that. MMT assumes that nearly all countries, I mean, unless you're a Zimbabwe or something, nearly all countries have monetary sovereignty. Many critics say, no, this is actually not true. Beyond the United States and maybe a few other countries like Germany or Japan or the UK or whatever, there are actually very few monetarily sovereign countries in the world. And in fact, some people say that it is uniquely American. Remember that MMT, like all theories, MMT has a geographical as well as a historical origin, and most MMT advocates are actually American. So a lot of people say that this is simply a rationalization of America's unique monetary position in the world, where it can essentially, where the currency that it issues is essentially world money and so on. As we'll see, even this is not true. I think MMT is wrong even in the case of the United States in this respect, but let's examine what they say about monetary sovereignty. what they say about monetary sovereignty ignores the fact that there is an external sector. For every country, there is a rest of the world. And money, whatever money, there has to be some kind of arrangement which allows that country to deal with the rest of the world in terms of trade as well as in terms of financial flows. So this external sector, as far as that is concerned, most countries may issue their own currency. They may accept taxes in them, but they cannot pay external trade or financial obligations in them. Or they cannot always do so. Most poor countries are too reliant on imports of key capital goods from other countries that will not accept their currency. If India wants to import vast quantities of, say, equipment to build electric power stations or what have you, the United States or Germany or whatever, they are not going to accept Indian rupees as part of their obligation. If India wants to, India has financial obligations in dollars that it must earn dollars to pay. So in that sense, many countries do not even issue all their obligations, that is to say, all the state debt that they issue, it is not issued in their own currency. And they cannot do so, or rather, let me rephrase that. If they do so, if that's what they want to try and do, they have to impose strict capital controls. Okay. So this applies, of course, to most poor countries, but it can also apply to richer countries. For example, the United Kingdom or France will face declines in their exchange rates and increases in their borrowing costs if their trade or financial imbalances deteriorate beyond a certain point. And of course, to the extent that they don't, or let me rephrase that, they don't deteriorate as much or as easily as they would for India or Indonesia or Turkey or what have you, because these are imperialist countries that are drawing incomes from the rest of the world. Okay, so essentially, and I would say that this even applies to the United States. Even the United States, which is accused of having this exorbitant privilege of issuing its own currency to all the world and all the world accepts it, there are limits to that process as well. Okay, so these are the prevailing criticisms. Now let me make a few further criticisms. And I'm this is my second last slide, so we won't be that much longer. Okay, so some further criticisms. Now, is my first question about MMT is it really a cure for all our ills, particularly given that we already knew from Keynes or Minsky or many other people that the budget constraint that neoliberals claim to be governments don't have money or whatever, this was never true. We know that we all have always known that governments have more leeway than the neoliberals and the monetarists have ever told us. So given that, is MMT really a cure for our ills? Is it really telling us anything we did not know from these people? Are our ills confined to not being able to finance social programs? I think not. Although MMT arose to point out that the American government and the Federal Reserve and maybe a few other governments are already printing money to bail out finance, they have actually made very few criticisms of financialization as such. This is what I find perplexing. Moreover, they accept the conceit that the US dollar is world money because they actually discount the reality of the external sector for most countries. So essentially, they are completely at home with the idea, which is the idea of those who support the dollar's world role, that countries outside the US are no different from American states and cities that trade between firms, say, in New York and firms, say, in Manchester or Mumbai, are no different from trade and financial exchanges between New York and Minneapolis and Miami. This, of course, is not true, but that's kind of what it implies. In reality, monetary sovereignty is misnamed. It could actually be referring to monetary imperialism. And what's more, it's a monetary imperialism that's already under attack. So That's one set of points. Another set of points is that it is open to question whether MMT really solves our ills. Let's think about what really ails our economies. What really ails our economies is, number one, predatory rather than productive economies. Our economies are financialized economies. They have become rentier economies. That is to say, economies dominated by people who essentially make unearned incomes. People who really work actually make relatively lower incomes. So we are enriching an idle class and impoverishing those who really work, workers and peasants, and even to some extent small businesses the world over. Another ill that ails us is a dollar-denominated international financial sector that keeps in place what a friend and I, Michael Hudson and I, call the world creditocracy, permitting the richest in all countries to escape national taxation and regulation. We suffer from high demand for assets, which it's best to think of assets as things that are already produced. They have been produced in the past, and people are competing to own them. But our welfare really depends on the production of new goods and services, and that production of new goods and services being strangled by financialization. So essentially, this is a huge problem. Of course, inequality, which is entirely, Thomas Piketty wrote this Doorstopper book in which he said it is simply the logic of capitalism to do this. No, the financialization of our economies over the last 40 years is far more to blame for the historic rise in inequality than anything else. It has continuously shifted income, not only from the poor to the rich, but it has shifted income from the productive sector to the financial sector. And despite all of this accumulation of money, in fact, and despite commanding all this capital, actually, there has been relatively low investment in all these 40 years and progressively lower. And this has slowed growth even as working people and the environment are being laid waste before our eyes. Okay, so growth is slow, even though the land and the people are being worked harder and harder and harder. How do we get this? This is what we need to cure. It burdens productive firms and workers with debt. And finally, it has reoriented our productive economies to produce frills. Why is it that the most neoliberal economies are suffering the most in the pandemic? They're suffering because a lot of what we have been producing, like tourism, restaurant meals, and so on, are frills, and we have less and less capacity to produce what we really need, whether it is PPE or drugs or medical equipment. These are the more obvious examples. So that's another point. So to conclude, what do we really need instead? Yes, of course, we need to know that the budget constraint is not as great as neoliberals claim, but we knew that already. Beyond that, we need to do a lot of things. First of all, fixing all of these things requires increased government spending for sure, but it requires a lot more. What else does it require? Unless we can curtail, regulate, nationalize the financial sector, most incomes generated by various social programs that you can institute will simply leak back into the financial sector. If you give lots of money to people right now without extinguishing their debt, it will simply go into the coffers of the financial institutions and the rich people who own them. Unless we impose capital controls, a lot will simply leak out into the dollar-denominated predatory international creditocracy. So we need to return to what used to be called financial repression, which was the key to the prosperity of the golden age. The 50s and the 60s and the 70s, they were prosperous because most countries during that time had capital controls. We need to match publicly organized increases in income with the production of key essentials: housing, healthcare, transport, food, culture even. All of these things need to be produced in adequate quantity and quality before we can advance further. And this requires money, but it requires a lot more than that. There has to be a massive restructuring of economies away from the production of frills. We can produce Coca-Cola more easily than we can produce milk, just to use a metaphor. This is the kind of economy we need to move away from. And all of this entails planning the production of what has not been being produced spontaneously in a capitalist economy, and doing so in a non-inflationary manner. That is to say, yes, the government has the power to produce money, but it has to do so in a way that actually fulfills needs. Otherwise, it will be inflationary. Put another way, we need to return to Marx and his conscious organization of production, and to Keynes and his socialization of investment. We need to think about democratic planning. We need to think about public utility banking. We need to expand the direct production of use values like education, housing.
30 seconds.
Yeah, I'm just about to conclude. We need to expand the direct production of things through public provision, such as the ones I mentioned, and in the case of Canada, a country like ours, we also need to think about a green economic diversification away from our reliance on resource extraction, fossil fuels, etc. So that's my talk for today. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Radhika. Thank you so much. Okay, moving to our next speaker, Yasin, studied political economy as a PhD at New York University and is a member of Socialist Action in Toronto. But of course, most importantly, he is the father of two smart and beautiful girls, Oza and Isla. Yasin, you got the floor.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, the godmother of one of my children, Rosa. And Radhika, thank you very much. You explained MMT, also known as the modern monetary theory or magic money tree idea, and its deficits very well. And it is also important to discuss this issue among us who are politically active or committed to social equality, because this idea is presented and marketed as a new left idea. On the one hand, it's true that it's an alternative to mainstream economics. Also, some of its objectives are in alignment with the working class politics. Like orthodox economic theory, it aims for growth and enriching private sector, but also it also borrows from the left ideas of full employment, which is one of the objectives of this theory. Plus, it also wants to control inflation by increased taxation, which would withdraw money from the market. Hence, the money supply in the market would be less. Hence, inflation will be controlled. Also, the printed money, according to this theory, can be used to fund some social needs, including universal healthcare, free college tuition, so on and so forth. And they're fine with the government debt as long as the economy grows, as long as inflation is under control, full employment is there, and other social needs are covered. But this theory, resembles Keynesian idea, which in bare bones welcomed the government spending to boost economic growth. But as we observed, at least in the late capitalism, when economy at large is not productive, government spending is not necessarily creating a very productive economy, even a very productive capitalism does it. So why? Because government spending is not being channeled towards productive investments. So Keynesians, like the supporters of monetary MMT, they argue that the newly created money or the increased government spending will eventually help the private companies invest in productive investments, which will increase the general welfare of the society. But the money is not going to the productive investments as long as there is a casino economy where financial sector is more attractive than producing surplus value for the capitalists. So money is going to the casinos, for virtual casinos, real casinos, the financial sector, and not to the real economy. And this also builds on, I think MMT builds on a very neoliberal idea of and practice of quantitative easing. As you would remember after the 2008 crisis, that was the QE policies, loose monetary policies was the answer of the capitalists to the crisis. In bare bones, what was it? So central banks were using their wealth, money, their billions of dollars to buy government and corporate bonds from the commercial banks. So the banks had all this money. And the idea was the banks would lend this money, cheap money, to the companies, and the companies would invest this cheap money with low borrowing costs to productive sectors. Hence, the economy would be restored. But what happened? What happened? This happened. Yes, the companies borrowed the money, but they did not spend this money on investment. They rather spent that money making money in the making more profits in the financial sector. So that's why the stock market recovered very fastly at the same time, along with the productive economy stagnating. And this is exactly what is going on with the capitalist response to the financial crisis that is occurring as a result of the health crisis. So all in all, as Radhika excellently summarized, monetary solution, even a fiscal solution, is not possible as long as you keep the basic tenets, basic qualities of capitalism in place. If you keep private ownership of means of production, if you keep the late capitalist dynamics, which encourage financial gains over productive investments, the newly created money or wealth will be channeled towards making profits in the financial sector or elsewhere, not in the satisfaction of the needs of the people. Radhika, thank you very much. It was a great presentation. I'm sure that we will receive great questions and we will build on that. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Yasin. Okay, before we go to our other speaker, remind him that his mic is muted. Organizer in British Columbia. He once edited the Chartered Professional Accountants of Canada and was a top leader of the League for Socialist Action, predecessor organization of Socialist Action in the 1970s. So welcome, Comrade Gary.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Yeah, to this day, I'm the only Bolshevik chartered accountant I know.
Actually, I have to say something, Gary, at this point. Sorry for the interruption, but I believe Capital is the best manual of accounting you've ever come across. We'll discuss that some other time.
In any case, Radhika defined MMT, talked about the sovereign independent currency that is required and how rare that is. In fact, I would say that it doesn't exist totally anywhere. Inflation will not kick in if the government spends lavishly. Even if the government spends lavishly, it runs a deficit as long as there is spare productive capacity in the economy. And I would say there has almost always been spare productive capacity. Capitalism never seems to be able to use its productive capacity. And productive capacity has been running 70, 75, even lower, 60% sometimes. It just doesn't use the capacity except where there's profit involved. Taxes do not fund public spending. Governments decide what they're going to do, and then they use taxes in order to manage demand in the economy. In any case, MMT followers are wrong to say that the state creates the demand for money. Under capitalism, as the Positive Money campaign have highlighted, the vast bulk of money in circulation, 97% of all the money in the economy, and this point was already made, is not created by governments, but by private banks in the form of deposits. The money is created in response to demands from customers and investors as credit and loans. When demand dries up in terms of falling household consumption and business investment, so too does demand for money. So the state can create money, but it cannot ensure that the money is put into use, at least not in useful ways. Indeed, the vast programs of quantitative easing that have been conducted across advanced capitalist world since 2008 crash are a testament to this. Trillions have been pumped into the economy by central bankers over the decade, and to what effect? Business investment and GDP growth remain subdued. And asset prices in the stock market and of property, gold, cryptocurrencies, and even artwork and fine wines froth and fizz like a newly opened bottle of champagne. In short, the speculators are having a field day whilst ordinary people have more and more of a struggle to put food on the table. In summary, it is not the state that creates the demand for money, but the needs of capitalist production. And this production is ultimately driven by one thing: profit. Businesses invest, produce, and sell in order to make profit. The capitalists cannot make a profit, they will not produce, they will not create jobs. It is as simple as that. And yet MMT has nothing to say about profit and the motor force of capitalism. As a result, it cannot explain the real dynamics of the economy under capitalism. Rather than printing money and bureaucratically managing economic demand, socialists should be calling for economic planning, as Radhika says. But you cannot plan what you do not control, and you cannot control what you do not own. MMT, therefore, however, avoids the key question of economic ownership. In fact, it largely avoids the question of capitalist production and economic laws that govern it altogether. After all, by its own admission, it is not so much an analysis of the capitalist system, but a description of the relationship between government spending, taxes, and the money supply. In glossing over these questions, however, MMT fails to recognize the fundamental realities of our economy. It's not just numbers on a screen or equations on a chalkboard, but living flesh and blood with women and men struggling to put food on the table and raise their children. Indeed, like Keynesianism, MMT's economic analysis seems completely devoid of the issue of class and the fact that we live in a class society composed of antagonistic economic interests, those of the exploiters and those of the exploited. For example, when MMT talks about the state, what kind of state are they referring to? As Marx noted in the Capitalist Manifesto, under capitalism, it is the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. If we want a government that will run the economy in the interest of ordinary people, then we need a worker state. But where in MMT is the role of organizing the working class and running and managing society? Lenin once remarked that capitalism, far from being a democracy, represents the dictatorship of the banks. And his imperialism, he talked about a process that has culminated in the financialization of most of the market. But instead of overthrowing this dictatorship, MMT advocates suggest replacing it by another, a dictatorship of one bank, the central bank. In this future vision of the MMTers, who would be in charge of this omnipotent central bank? The working class or the capitalist class? Similarly, the big monopolies who dominate the economy under capitalism. Are these to remain in private hands, producing for profit? A national bank directing society's resources around the economy would certainly be a vital element of a socialist plan of production. But in this setup, such a bank would be under the control of the working class. Is this what MMTs envision? MMTers state that their theory gives us the power to imagine truly transformational politics. But at the end of the day, they do not propose fundamentally challenging the power of the capitalist class or altering the current economic relations, the ownership relations, or the motives for production. Private property for them remains inviolable and sacrosanct. The anarchy of the market is untouched. Rather than the working class seizing the means of production, prominent MMT theorist Bill Mitchell asserts it's the working class seizing the means of production of money, he emphasizes. Richard Murphy goes further, reassuring right-wing critics of MMT that supporters have no plans to sweep the private sector aside. Like their Keynesian predecessors, then MMT's strategy is the one that saves and patches up a system that has completely outlived its usefulness, and that is the capitalist system. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Comrade Gary. Okay, folks, so the format, as was explained a little earlier, I will go to Kurt in a minute, and he's going to draw 3 questions from our audience. And we have 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, please. I want a strict 5 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3 of the questions. And the lineup of speakers will be Gary will answer first, then Radhika, then Yasin. You have up to 5 minutes. So Kurt, what are our first 3 questions?
Okay, so to let our audience know, we will be answering the questions based on the order that they were given, supplied that you have not asked the question before. So our first 4 questions are people who asked multiple questions, so I will only ask the first 2. Okay, so the first question is from Sam, and he asks, key for us, we can't control what we don't own. How much of the use of the printing of the dollar is tied to, key for US, we can't control what we don't own. How much of the use of the printing of the dollar is tied to US military power? Barry Weisletter asks, a democratically planned economy requires taking production out of the market by nationalizing the key levers of the economy and planning them. Pumping money, it's a statement, into the system will give it to the, pumping money into the system will give it to the rich. Brendan Bacchus says, curious the professor's thoughts on the mentioned UBI and various forms of it. What may be good and what are some of the forms of it that can be harmful?
Okay, so you got the 3 questions. So we will start with Gary, and you have up to 5 minutes each, folks. Gary?
Military spending is one of the ways that U.S. capitalism has used. First of all, it wanted to dominate the world and use a different form of imperialism than the United Kingdom, which literally controlled colonies. They wanted to control it more by Bretton Woods and the World Trade Agreement and various kinds of international capital controls and trade controls that they dominated. But ultimately they needed military power to keep down people who didn't want to cooperate or wanted to get out of that market and that world. So they needed a massive military, but they've expanded it well beyond anything that's really necessary. And it's part of creating a place for employment, and it supports their airline industry. It supports their all the kinds of motor industries, tanks, and just amazing technology requirements that it has. Not that any of this is useful to humanity, and it could all be, much of this stuff is totally unnecessary for human consumption. We're now busy comparing the quality of stealth jets around the world. Well, there's no need, whatever. Ordinary human beings, working class people, have no need for any stealth jets of any type. Certainly in Canada, we don't need to spend $19 billion in order to buy stealth fighters. So it's useless production, but it has gone to keep capitalism limping along as one of its functions. And it forces other states to do similar things, like, just to be able to keep the United States a little bit off their backs. I'm not sure what percentage of a dollar, I don't know the percentage of total spending that is military spending. I can't answer that. The other thing in terms of what Barry was saying on nationalization, yeah, you have to have social ownership. The question of who controls things is determined by the question of who owns things. And you really have to start, I've come to the conclusion over some years now that we really have to start nationalizing the financial institutions as the beginning of everything. You can make clear arguments for the nationalization of wood in BC because we have a serious housing crisis. And wood wood is no good as a fuel. It's a high carbon producing fuel, but it can build a lot of homes. Almost every home in BC is a frame home. And we have our housing cost $738,000 average. Toronto's cost $578,000 average, but we have the same average wage. So, I mean, the housing crisis is ridiculous here. We have huge numbers of homeless people. And we have a wood industry that has been partly crippled by Trump tariffs. So we need to nationalize that. But really, all those arguments aside, we need to take over the banks and the other big financial institutions, the insurance companies. And we even have to look at the pension funds because, yes, they're for employees for the most part, but they are massive capitalist institutions. I served on the board of the Teachers' Pension Fund in Ontario for 15 years, and I was the chair of the board chair of the investment committee, and I associated, much to my chagrin, with some of the major capitalists of Canada and coming together to common deals. And it is a capitalist institution, I'm telling you. I mean, it's got a beneficial purpose for the workers, and it's a form of deferred wages, but it functions entirely as a capitalist institution.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Okay, Radhika?
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to begin by just giving a couple of comments or rejoinders for both Yasin and Gary, and then I want to take up the questions that were posed. So very quickly, I agree, of course, with all the things that they were both saying. But one of the things I'd like to point out is that Keynesianism should not be equated with MMT. I'm saying that Keynes already knew many of the things that MMT is saying, but one also has to remember that Keynes's critique of capitalism is much more radical than most Keynesians would have us believe. That is why because the name Keynesianism was appropriated by essentially people who presented an extremely sanitized, de-radicalized version of Keynes, which is Keynes equals demand management. There is a whole group of scholars who call themselves post-Keynesians, and they actually go back to Keynes's original ideas, which included included some very, very radical ideas. So, for example, Keynes says in the conclusion to the general theory that while demand management can work for a while, eventually it would stop working, and that would be the time it would no longer serve to provide what he called an optimum rate of investment. And that is the point where he says, I conceive, therefore, that a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment will prove the only means of securing an approximation to full employment. So what is he saying here? He's basically saying that the time will come when demand management will no longer work, and there will have to be a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment. The state will displace the private sector and take the lead in organizing the economy. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I think Gary rightly pointed out that these MMTers, their critique of the capitalist economy is so low that they basically say, well, it's okay to print money as long as there's slack capacity in the economy. But what does this mean? It means that they wish to keep the economy, our extremely problematic, highly financialized, unproductive economy, more or less the same as it is. Just paper it over with a little bit of basic income there or a little bit of jobs guarantee there. This is neither here nor there. Okay, so in terms of the questions, I just wanted to say that about military spending, I would say that the US dollar has, back in the 50s and 60s, the US had to go off gold precisely because the rest of the world essentially mounted an opposition to the US military spending in Vietnam and in Korea and elsewhere, which is why the US ran out of gold and it could no longer back the dollar with gold. Today, however, we don't see that as much. Certainly not from, basically, let me rephrase that. Today, we see a lot of resistance to that, but it's essentially coming from countries like China and Russia and other countries who are beginning to make alternative arrangements, alternatives to the to participating in the dollar creditocracy system. Most of the rest of the world, including most rich people in countries like Canada, the United States, and most third world countries, are very happy to participate in the US dollar system, which then gives the US a lot more leeway to spend crazy amounts of money on military buildup. So we must definitely bear that in mind. Somebody asked about UBI. I would say that naturally, I'm the first person to support a system in which there is no person who is left without not just a minimum income, but a livable income, an income that allows them to live in dignity and in autonomy. So I'm completely in favor of that. My only point is that the best way of organizing that is actually not just to institute a UBI, but to actually organize an economy in which employment and its rewards are widely shared. And then, yes, you may have a safety net to make sure that nobody falls. But first, you need to falls out of the safety net. So you have to create that safety net. But first, you have to create a full employment economy. We are already at a technological point where employment is the need for employment is low. Let's distribute employment and its rewards more widely. So let's engage everybody in the production and the consumption of things, because otherwise you are also creating disengagement. So that's basically, I mean, I'm happy to discuss it more, but that's basically what I think of UBI. On house price inflation and the housing crisis, I would just like to say that in most countries where you have a robust social housing program, you simply won't get the kind of crazy asset price inflation, house price inflation that you get, because there is direct production for need. People have houses, so they are not competing. Relatively less well-off people are not competing with one another, driving up the prices of goods beyond their own affordability. It is obscene what's going on right now, particularly for lower income people. And obviously, I mean, in a socialist society, we also don't want to have very high income differentials in the first place. So you won't have the high income people and the low income people. And finally, pensions. I think the definancialization of pensions is one of the biggest things we have to fight for, because what it's doing is it's creating a class of workers who have pensions, who have an interest in maintaining the very financial system that is strangling our economies and our productive capacities. We can talk more about that, but I just wanted to leave it there. You can have pensions that are not financialized. And it's important to start looking into that right away.
Thank you, Radhika. Yasin, 5 minutes.
Great questions. Keep them coming. Let me start with Sam's question about the US printing of dollars and its military power. So I'm sure that many of a huge percentage of the wealth or the money that is generated by US is being channeled towards the military. But reverse is also true. By ensuring its military dominance internationally, by ensuring its global hegemony, US is able to make its currency the international currency. So I think the very fact that dollar is perhaps the only international currency is because of its military power. So in other words, when US is attacking Iraq or the Middle East, it is not only going there to ensure it gets oil wealth, it also goes there to ensure that its global hegemony, which would allow US to be the boss of the financial system. And Brandon, great question about universal basic income. I'm not against it, but I have a big but there. If they introduce universal basic income by eliminating universal health care, public education system, social security net, then I will be against universal basic income if it is presented as an alternative to the protections that the society has. But if it is introduced in addition to the gains that the working class has accomplished over the years, why not? But I'm very skeptical, because politics do not take place in vacuum. It takes place in power relations and predominantly class relations. since nowadays the capitalist class, the class of the bosses, is stronger than the class of the working class, then I'm very skeptical about the new political solutions to the crises, or because those solutions usually tend to reinforce the power of the bosses. So yes to universal basic income, but let's be clever, smart, and be skeptical about what they do. Barry, great question. Barry said the printed money will be channeled to the poor, to the rich. Great, yes, exactly. Again, there is no such thing as society as a whole. Society is made of classes, and the newly created money will be channeled towards that entity which is divided across class lines. So if bosses in a society are stronger than the working class, it's highly likely that they will benefit from this newly printed money than the workers. But that's a distributive question, a question about distribution of the new money. There is also another question. So will creating money enforce or enable increase in labor productivity? I doubt it, because as the recent examples show, the printed money are not being channeled towards productive industries. Why? Because the decision makers are companies which has a motivation of making profits, and if you leave the economy to their decisions, they will not necessarily make investment decisions that will favor the increase in labor productivity. And compare that to an economy, a socialist economy, where the main means of production, big companies, are owned by the state. Then the investment decisions will be made not according to the profit expectations, but towards meeting the needs of the society. And if they increasing the labor productivity is deemed to be is decided to be a social need, that will be prioritized. Again, under late capitalism, printing money will less likely produce increased labor productivity. If we want generating more wealth in today's world, we need to democratically control the big companies, big production, big productive entities. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Yasin. Okay, so we're going to go back to our producer now, and he has put the questions on screen for the panelists to read, but he will have up to 5 minutes, and please, folks, keep it strictly to 5 minutes, and you will see your time rolling away if you keep an eye on the chat. So the lineup of speakers this time will be Yasin, Radhika, and Gary. And you have up to 5 minutes. Your questions are on the screen, but Kurt will read them.
Okay, so we'll start with John Rydell. Asks, Radhika, since you live on the prairies and have a strong sense of history, doesn't it strike you that MMT has similarities with social credit? Rabi Mahood asks, 2 questions. Is it financialization or a decline in the rate of profit that is at the root of the decline in productive investment we see in capitalist societies today? Corey David asks, Canada has huge financials and service sectors that look unlikely to shift into agriculture and industry to reshape economy to meet human needs. What is the best way to address the societal overhaul?
Okay, so you each have up to 5 minutes. Yasin, you're on.
Oh, I'm on? Okay. I will skip John's question. It is directed to Radhika directly, so I will move to Robbie's question about what is at the root of the decline in productive investment we see in capitalist societies today. And yes, Robbie's first of all, Robbie is making a sharp observation. The the rate of profit today still did not recover since the global recession, since the Great Recession. Plus, in fact, the rate of profit is still below the levels of the golden age of capitalism that took place in the 1960s. So we see a kind of a prolonged crisis of capitalism, and it is not going anywhere. And we see, sharp episodes of a breakdown, capitalist breakdown. But in addition to those sharp declines, we also see a general downward trend in capitalism. Is it financialization or decline in the rate of profit? Oh, great question. I think we should make another webinar on this. There are Marxists who support the idea that financialization is the trend that we should look at to understand the crisis of capitalism, whereas more classical Marxists support the idea that it's the decline in the rate of profit that is at the root of that capitalist decline. I think it's the rate of profit that we should focus on. For a better explanation of this, tune in to the next webinar. This is coincidental. I will be the speaker explaining the rate of profit next week and the crisis of capitalism. So I will delay my answer to Robbie. Log in next week, Robbie. I will try to answer your question in 25 minutes, not in two minutes. Corey, yes, you're right. I mean, Canada has a huge financial and service sector, and probably it will not shift into agriculture and industry. If we leave the economy to the hands of the capitalist class, probably you're right. Probably financial and service sectors will continue dominating the economy. That's why. But will it serve the needs of the society? Perhaps this is why we support a more controlled, democratically controlled economy. That's what we advocate, because if the society needs more agricultural entities, agricultural products, then perhaps we have to direct the productive capacity towards that goal. If the society needs more coffee mugs, perhaps we should make conscious decisions about investing more on the companies that make coffee mugs. But in capitalist economy, as you know, profit is the motivator of economic activity, and it is very unlikely that those decisions, economic decisions made by the capitalist firms, will have that rational aspect to it. It will as I think David Harvey said, the rationality of capitalism is being irrational, because it is like it prioritizes making profit regardless of the satisfaction of human needs. And periodically, we have those crises where we have, factories sitting idle, whereas there are workers unemployed willing to work, and people are dying of hunger. So capitalism at times, this is a systemic feature of it, is unable to bring the productive capacity with the workers who are willing to work to satisfy the needs of the people. That's why, remember 2008 crisis, there were many factories sitting idle. There were many people who were willing to work. At the same time, people were dying of their social needs. I hope I answered your question, Corey. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Yasin. Radhika?
Sure. Okay. First of all, hello, John. Lovely to know that you are in the audience, and thanks very much for your question. I personally think that there is no real connection between social credit and MMT. I mean, as far as I know, and you probably know better than me, but I understand social credit as a kind of a sort of left populist criticism of capitalism that sought to create a more democratically organized economy. As far as I can tell, MMT is not trying to do that. This is what we've just been talking about. So MMT is simply saying that we can print money if we like. And it's kind of carrying that much further than it actually should. As I say, it's the rational kernel of the idea is not new. And what they seem to be saying is, or the way in which they are driving it beyond certain limits of external sector constraints and inflation and so on, it's actually not paying any attention to the organization of the real economy. So that would be my answer to you. Perhaps it does reflect, I suppose the similarity that you see is that it does reflect a certain critique of the financial sector. So when social credit emerged, and by the way, social credit was not alone. There were such populisms in many other countries, European countries and so on. And I think that it was directed against what were seen to be big financial interests. And in my view, MMT again is actually not criticizing these financial interests at all. So I think I'm happy if you want to come back with some other considerations, but I personally didn't see very many connections. On the question of whether it's financialization or the decline in the rate of profit, I personally don't think that the two explanations are disconnected. In fact, they're intimately related. Consider this. Productivity began a long secular decline, as the work of Robert Gordon has shown, beginning in the 1970s. In the face of this, the Fordist or the Keynesian welfare state arrangements broke down because they critically relied on increasing productivity, keeping up high wages and profits, and so on. There ensued a class war and so on. Now, what's going on is that because the expected rate of profit has been declining, and part of the reason, by the way, it's also declining is because existing demand, as Robert Brenner pointed out, was saturated. And that meant that you had to do something to expand demand further. But of course, neoliberalism, rather than doing that, has constrained it ever more. So in that context, investment has never been very attractive. Productive investment has not been attractive. And that unattractiveness to capitalists of productive investment has sent profits that are being made into the financial sector to try to seek a higher rate of profit there. And that's essentially another section. In fact, the work of my partner, Alan Freeman, has also shown is that even though profits have been going into the financial sector, seeking a higher profit, financial sector profits have also been going down. So, and that's partly why you have then, and this is also very interestingly connected with QE, the quantitative easing, the constant injections of liquidity, etc. Because as profit margins in financial trades get thinner and thinner, you need more and more money to throw into those trades in order to make any serious profit. So the spread of leverage trading is huge. I mean, it's enormous, and that's why the financial sector needs an enormous supply of liquidity from the Federal Reserve to it in order to keep the financial merry-go-round going. So I think that until we shut down this crazy financial sector, we're not going to get anything like a rational economy that addresses the needs of people. Now, that's all I can say in the time that we have. And this directly relates to Corey's question. In order to get the financial sector to direct investment where we need it in the productive sector, we have to essentially control it, nationalize it, or essentially impose public utility banking rules on it. Probably this will not happen without some considerable degree of nationalization. And we need also to impose capital controls as long as rich people and financial institutions in our economy can escape to the treasure islands. And they are not just, the United States and the United Kingdom are giant treasure islands where money can seek havens to escape taxation, etc. So you need capital controls, you need public utility banking, and then you need to fashion a banking sector of the sort that will direct investment to, socialist societies do have banking sectors, but they function essentially to direct money to where it's needed according to the plan. So it's not going to spontaneously do it. We're going to have to make it do it ourselves in a planned and conscious way.
Thank you, Radhika. Okay, Gary?
Well, let me first of all say a few words on UBI from the previous set of questions. A lot of UBI people, it has its support both in very conservative circles and in left-wing circles. But the most common amount that I could find studying UBI proposals in Canada was for about $2,000 a month, above which it was argued that Canada simply couldn't afford it because it was so expensive, which is $24,000 a year, which, by the way, is the low-income cutoff definition of the poverty level. So basically, what we're saying is we could keep Canadians at the poverty level. I don't think that satisfies many of us. But the other thing is that how would that work? What would that actually do? Who ends up paying for it? Well, we know that more and more under neoliberalism, the corporations don't pay taxes. Essentially, they pass it to the extent they can, to the extent demand is elastic enough to permit. They put it into the prices, or they have neoliberal governments just cut the tax rates, and then they use offshoring to avoid taxes in other ways. The working class and small business pays tax. So what you do is, instead of taking part of the surplus value and using it to provide real benefits to the working class and those and the other sectors who aren't working but are poor, you are taking it from the working class, and we are subsidizing our peers, and the rich stay rich. What you need instead is class struggle. What you want to do is take money out of the hands of the rich and put it into the hands of the working class, and that's class struggle. For example, I went to a different side of this question, which was about the financialization versus falling rate of profit. Falling rate of profit has motivated a tremendous amount of automation and a tremendous amount of escape into very, very low-paid working classes in foreign countries and super exploitation. Canada is very good at that. Our whole mining sector is doing that in Africa and Latin America and Asia, and that we have some of the most ruthless imperialist companies that use mercenaries to kill people who try to take little bits of gold from the areas they control, who beat up people and don't pay their wages, end up not paying the royalties, just not paying it, not paying taxes. There's been major court cases on this. So, that's all in defense of trying to offset the falling rate of profit. That's what that is. And they are ruthless about it, and they will continue to be. But the drive for profit, supersedes anything remotely approaching the desperate human needs that we see before us to defend ourselves from pandemic, to defend ourselves from economic catastrophe and ecological catastrophe, and so on. So it's driven by profit is the motive, and if the rate of profit falls, they do whatever they can to prop it up. And it's so I think that's probably all. How am I doing, Elizabeth? Do I have any time?
Yes, wrap up, please. And yes, you do. You do.
Okay. Social credit. Social credit essentially was a theory of matching prices and incomes by giving dividends to consumers. It in its form, yes, there was a populist element to it, as there is to Trumpism, but in its form here in the West, in Alberta and BC, where it took effect for many years as governments, it was right-wing for sure. And it was mostly trying to make sure that what capitalists produced could be purchased, much more than trying to help the poor live. So it definitely, I guess I see it different than Radhika in that respect, and how I lived under it here in BC back in the early 70s. And that's it. I'm finished.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gary. Okay, so folks, we're going to have time for one more round. There will be 2 questions. I think they're already on screen, but Kurt will read them anyway. And you have up to 3 minutes this time to answer one or all questions, whatever you prefer. So up to 3 minutes, and here are the questions. Lineup will be Radhika, Yasin, and Gary. Kurt?
Okay, so our last 2 questions, I will start with Rosemary, because she hasn't posed a question before. Radhika, what was the driver of the prosperity in the 60s and 70s to which you made reference in your talk? And then the last question from Barry Weisletter, is a sustainable Green New Deal possible via MMT, or does it require socialization of the commanding heights of the economy?
Okay, Radhika, please.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Barry, and thanks, Rosemary. So I'll take Barry's question first. I mean, I think that from everything we've said so far, it would seem to me that basically creating a green transformation of the economy will require far more than money. It will actually require shutting down many of the worst polluting and climate warming industries, particularly in Canada, where fossil fuels is such a big and lucrative sector. So I think it will have to involve a contestation of the power of capital, right in its right where it hurts. So there's going to have to be a socialization, as you say, of the what you call the commanding heights of the economy, and the commanding heights will include all the natural monopolies. So it will include all the resource sector. It will include things like transport, anything that the utilities, the electricity generation, etc. Anything that's the natural monopoly, you begin with them, and then you can proceed further in terms of what else to do and so on. Rosemary, that's a great question, and yes, I did refer to the prosperity of the 50s and 60s and even the 70s, and I think that the way I understand it is that the key to the prosperity of those decades was the underlying key, the most fundamental thing was an expansion in working class consumption. That is to say, thanks to the war, thanks to the empowerment of people in the course of the previous 30 years, First World War, Depression, Second World War, etc., and the feeling of never again to go back to the poverty and deprivation that people saw, that created a sort of momentum behind high wages, organizing economies for full employment, creating welfare states, and so on. And all of this put a flow below working class consumption and working class incomes, and that meant that and that expansion of demand was a huge stimulus to productive investment, and I think that was the key. And neoliberalism is unable to provide that prosperity or to create the conditions for that prosperity because it tends to constrain demand. It tends to take incomes away from people who will spend it, namely working people, and give it to those who do not spend it, and they don't invest it either. So that to me was the key. There were a couple of other things. I would say that capital controls, which were in place throughout this period until the early to mid 70s, they were very important because they kept capital caged in their national cages. They did not have the capacity to escape the national cage in order to go off and make profits elsewhere. And another really important key to that was the rising productivity that Fordism was able to afford, and that is no longer possible because we're moving to a qualitatively. Oh, and one more thing, sorry, last point. My last point is that throughout this period, commodities remain relatively cheap. By commodities, I mean the primary commodities largely produced by third world countries. And as they began to become more expensive, as represented by the oil shock of 1973, metropolitan capitalism ran into crisis. So those are some of my reflections.
Okay, thank you, Radhika. Yasin?
Thank you very much. I'm learning a lot from this panel, too, especially from Radhika. And if I understand her correctly, she advocates for capital controls, and she sees this as a kind of a necessary step, but not sufficient step. I think she also supports the idea that the big banks, which are the pushers of the financialization, should be dealt with. Perhaps
pushing is a great term.
perhaps nationalization of these banks under social control is a more radical and long-term solution to the financialization that is ruining the planet. But capital controls can be the first step, perhaps. And secondly, I mean, I read Radhika's work, and in her presentation, she focused more on the demand side and increasing the purchasing power of the working class so that the demand, aggregate demand, can increase, which can boost the economies across the world. But I'm sure that she also prioritizes in her analysis the relations of production and importance of the control of the commanding heights of the economy by the working classes. So, and I think this partly answers one of the questions that Barry asked: what is to be done? I think we're in a great conjecture. MMT, for example, shows us the direction that we have to go, which is importance of using the financial, monetary and fiscal tools, or whatever we have, towards the satisfaction of the social needs. But the question is whether MMT, that theory, is a good tool to reach to the goals that it formulates. I don't think that theory is comprehensive enough to provide us a roadmap to the objective it underlies. And I think Radhika also provide a great framework to explain that to us. Yes, to what MMT wants to achieve, but probably not a very good tool to reach to those goals. And yes, so I guess I'll stop here too. But obviously, there's the elephant in the room. So financial economic theories will not solve the working classes' problems. Their radical theories are good tools to increase people's understanding of how the world works. But the real change will come from the political activism. The ideas will not change the world. The political movements will. And so while we critically approach to these theories such as MMT, which are becoming more and more popular, we shouldn't forget about the important aspect of political activism. But usually it's my character that I'm an optimist. Things are, at least in academic circles, things are changing among the economists. The mainstream economy, I'm wrapping up. The new liberal, neoclassical economics is losing its power. After the pandemic hit, the government started, increasing their deficits to pay for the difficulties that to pay for the measures against the pandemic. And whereas the orthodoxy said, the budget deficit should be under control, inflation should be under control, we should not have government debt. All this is now garbage. They changed their discourse radically. So it is possible. Even they're in the crisis. The economists of the capitalist world don't know what to do. They're changing their discourses. This is a great time. This is a great time to critically approach the intellectual, academic, and intellectual. It's a great time to approach to criticize the mainstream economics and challenge them. Also, it's a great time to be politically active and bring the real change. Thank you very much, Radhika. It was an awesome presentation.
Thank you.
Gary?
Yes, thank you, Radhika. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed your Dimension article on COVID and the crisis of capitalism. It was very interesting reading. Let me say that what I'm thinking about is how do the workers move forward? kind of what Yasin said, that is that it isn't, ideas play a very important role, because what they do is they train the leadership of the future leadership of the working class. And it's in struggling with those ideas and evolving an understanding of how capitalism works that we evolve our tactics and strategies and our down to slogans and our ability to parse the crises of capitalism and provide leadership. So to my mind, the study of ideas and the struggle with ideas plays that kind of role. But the power is in the working class. The only people that can bring capitalism to its knees are the mobilized, self-confident and self-conscious working class. So along that line, again, respond to my mind. If you take a look at those issues like massive automation, massive export of production to the super exploitation of the third world and so on, our working class here, we should be really pushing things like 4 days for 5 with no reduction of benefits, or 3 days for 5. I mean, what we're trying to do is force, in a way that UBI never can, to come back to that, to force money out of the pockets of the massive hoarders of this wealth into our class, into the hands of our class, and that takes class struggle. I don't believe UBI will ever happen. I don't think that the capitalists will allow it.
1 minute.
But I think these kinds of demands that move massive amounts of money, that would be a 20% increase in the amount of national income that goes to the working class, and it's got to come out of the hands we'll try to make it come out of the hands of the capitalists by not allowing them to cut other social benefits. What happens? How does capitalism pay for that? My answer, I guess, as a person who's engaged in the struggle every day, is I don't care. That's not my job. That's their job. Their job is to figure out how they're going to meet the demands of the workers. And when they can't meet them, our job is to just shove them aside and take power. So I don't care ultimately whether it's practical for capitalism. And I don't try to work out their solutions. I just try to work out what's necessary for the working class to live and prosper.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so thank you to Yasin and Gary, and a very special thanks to you, Radhika. Your presentation was very interesting, very educational. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure our listening audience did too. So thank you so very much. Thanks once again to our producer, Young in Mississauga, and everyone, of course, who participated. And please consider buying a subscription to Socialist Action newspapers, only $25 for 1 year, delivered to your door by our very reliable postal workers. So website at www.socialistaction.ca. That's www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada at gmail.com. Just give us a call at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. And once again, of course, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. Now, our next Socialist Action is on Thursday, 7 p.m., and it is titled Boom or Bust, The Future of Global Capitalism, with Socialist Action political economist Yasin Kaya, and also Corey David here in Toronto, and speakers to be in. For the details, just visit www.socialist.ca. So, comrades and friends, in the meantime, please stay safe, stay healthy, and be